Jake Martinez slouched in his regulation folding chair, watching the galaxy's most insufferable beings compete in what could only be described as the universe's worst pissing contest. The Galactic Heritage Convention was supposed to be about cultural exchange, but apparently nobody told the participants that bragging about dead relatives wasn't exactly what the organizers had in mind. "And then," proclaimed Vex the Mighty, his forearms gesticulating wildly while his tentacle beard quivered with excitement, "my great-great-great-grandfather Vex the Considerably More Mighty single-handedly held off the Crimson Horde for 73 cycles, armed with nothing but his ancestral plasma sword and the burning righteousness of our people." A chorus of appreciative clicks and whistles erupted from the assembled crowd. Jake took another sip of his lukewarm coffee, the only Earth beverage the station's replicators could manage without making it taste like recycled coolant, and wondered if it was too late to fake a diplomatic emergency. "Impressive," chittered Buzzkill, the insectoid representative whose name Jake was pretty sure was meant ironically. "But my hive mother once ate an entire moon to prevent it from colliding with our breeding grounds. The calcium from that celestial body still strengthens our carapaces to this day." More excited alien noises. Jake checked his watch, only 4 hours into what was supposed to be a week-long cultural celebration. At this rate, he'd need therapy by Tuesday. "Oh please," scoffed Nebula, born of stars, her crystalline form refracting the station's lighting into nauseating rainbow patterns. "My ancestor didn't just save one world, she wove herself into the fabric of space-time itself, becoming a living constellation that still guides lost travelers home. You can literally see her in the night sky, from 17 different star systems." Jake cleared his throat. The sound was remarkably unimpressive compared to the various roars, chirps, and harmonic frequencies the other species used to show enthusiasm. "That's nice," he said, his voice carrying all the excitement of someone reading tax code. "My grandma survived winter once." The convention hall fell silent. Several aliens turned to stare at him, their various optical organs blinking in confusion. "I'm sorry," said Vex the Mighty, lowering his ceremonial goblet of fermented starfruit. "Did you say winter?" "Yeah, winter. You know, cold season, snow, freezing temperatures," Jake shrugged. "It was pretty rough, lasted about 4 months. Buzzkill's mandibles clicked together in what Jake had learned was the insectoid equivalent of barely contained laughter. 4 months? My ancestor battled the heat death of the universe for 4 millennia! "Cool story," Jake said, and meant it about as much as a parking ticket. Grandma Martinez had no heat, no food delivery, and the nearest grocery store was 40 miles away through unplowed roads. Made it through just fine. Nebula, born of stars, actually started giggling, a sound like wind chimes having a nervous breakdown. "Oh, this is precious. The human thinks seasonal weather patterns are comparable to cosmic heroism." "Right?" Vex gestured toward Jake with all 4 arms. "What's next, human Jake Martinez? Are you going to tell us about the time your uncle fixed a broken water pump?" "Actually, that was pretty impressive too. Uncle Bob jerry-rigged a replacement part from a carburetor and some coat hangers. Lasted 15 years. The laughter was getting louder now. Jake didn't mind. He'd been to middle school. Alien mockery was basically a vacation by comparison. That's when the alarms started blaring. The universal translation system kicked into overdrive as panicked announcements filled the air in 17 different languages simultaneously. The gist was pretty clear, even through the chaos. Something very old, very angry, and very hungry was heading their way. "Attention all convention attendees," came the station commander's voice over the intercom, only slightly cracking with terror. "We have received word that the Devourers have breached the Outer Rim defenses. This is not a drill. Repeat, the Devourers have returned and they're heading directly for our sector." The convention hall erupted into chaos. Aliens were screaming, fainting, and in at least one case molting from stress. Jake finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. "So," he said to no one in particular, "I guess we're about to find out whose ancestors were worth bragging about." The emergency klaxons had barely stopped screaming when Thax-9 decided this was the perfect time to double down on his family history. The 7-foot-tall Kree warrior stood atop his chair, his battle-scarred hide gleaming under the station's emergency lighting, and launched into what Jake could only assume was either a war cry or really aggressive poetry. "Fear not, fellow beings," Thax-9 bellowed, his voice carrying enough bass to rattle the floor panels. "The blood of heroes flows through these veins. My great ancestor Thax the Original wrestled with star-eating demons in the void between galaxies. He strangled 3 of them with his bare tentacles and used their corpses as stepping stones to leap between dying worlds. "Oh, that's adorable," Wisp interjected, her ethereal form flickering between dimensions in what Jake was learning to recognize as the universal sign of smug superiority. "Your ancestor fought demons, how quaint. My forebears didn't just battle creatures, they rewrote the fundamental laws of physics. Great Aunt Wisp of the Endless Void once convinced entropy itself to take a coffee break. Reality literally bent around her will." Jake raised his hand like he was in a particularly boring college lecture. "Question, when you say reality bent around her, are we talking metaphorically, or did she actually, break the universe?" "Oh, completely literally," Wisp said, her voice carrying the kind of pride usually reserved for parents whose toddler had successfully used the potty. "She folded space-time into origami swans for entertainment. The swans are still out there somewhere, flying through hyperspace and confusing navigational computers." "Right," Jake nodded slowly. "So your great-aunt was either a cosmic god or completely insane." "Why not both?" Wisp giggled. Shard Prime, the crystalline being who looked like someone had taught a geode to walk and develop an attitude problem, decided this was her moment to shine. Literally. Her entire body began glowing with soft blue light as she began her tale. "Your ancestors sound delightful," she said, her voice ringing like expensive wine glasses having a civilized argument. "But consider this. My crystalline forebears didn't just bend reality or fight demons. They harvested dying stars and forged them into weapons capable of cutting through the fabric of existence itself. The stellar forge of my people turned collapsing suns into swords that could slice through time." "Hold up," Jake said, because apparently he was now the designated voice of reason in a room full of cosmic agamic pynite. "You're telling me your ancestors made swords out of stars? Actual stars, those giant balls of nuclear fusion that are thousands of times bigger than most planets?" "Well, yes. Obviously we had to compress them first." "Obviously." Buzzkill, not to be outdone, started clicking his mandibles in a rhythm that Jake was pretty sure was either very bad music or very good Morse code. "Stellar forges. Reality manipulation. Child's play. My hive ancestors didn't just use the universe, they improved it. The Great Queen Buzz Original literally gave birth to a dimension. An entire pocket universe exists because she decided our reality wasn't spacious enough for proper breeding. Billions of my people still live there, in a realm created from pure maternal will." The other aliens made appropriately odd noises. Jake sipped his cold coffee and tried to process the fact that he was apparently the only being in the room whose family tree didn't include cosmic deities. "That's all very impressive," he said finally. "Really, your ancestors sound like they could have arm-wrestled God and had a 50-50 chance of winning. Very cool." "And yet," Thax9 said, his tone suggesting he was about to deliver what he thought was a devastating comeback, "you continue to insist that your grandmother's survival of a seasonal weather pattern somehow compares to these legendary feats." "I mean, yeah, winter's rough." Vex the Mighty slammed his goblet down so hard it cracked the table. "Human Jake Martinez, with all due respect to your species' amusing delusions of adequacy, how can you possibly compare 4 months of cold weather to the cosmic heroism we've just described? Your grandmother didn't battle star demons or reshape reality or forge weapons from the hearts of dying suns." Jake looked around the room at all these incredible beings, each one descended from what were apparently the universe's most overachieving ancestors, and felt something that might have been pity. "You're right," he said. "Grandma Martinez never fought a star demon, never folded space-time, never gave birth to a dimension or convinced entropy to take a lunch break. All she did was keep 5 kids alive through the worst winter in Montana's recorded history, with no heat, no electricity, and exactly $73 to last until spring." The aliens exchanged glances. Several made sounds that the universal translator helpfully labeled as confused chittering. "But here's the thing," Jake continued, warming up to his theme. "Your ancestors were heroes, right? Legendary figures of myth and wonder. Mine was just a regular person who did what she had to do to survive. And somehow, I'm thinking that might be exactly what we need right now." Outside the convention hall's windows, the first wave of devourer ships appeared on the horizon like hungry shadows against the stars. Jake finished his coffee and stood up. "Besides," he said, "you want to know the really impressive part about Grandma Martinez surviving that winter? She didn't just survive it. She made it look easy." As if the universe had been waiting for Jake's punchline, the emergency klaxons decided to have a complete nervous breakdown. The pleasant amber lighting of the convention hall switched to the kind of angry red strobing that made everything look like a low-budget horror movie. "All personnel to battle stations!" The station commander's voice crackled over the intercom, now openly panicking instead of just slightly terrified. "Devourer ships have breached the inner perimeter. Repeat, we are now under direct assault by an enemy force that hasn't been seen for 3,000 years, and frankly, we have no idea what we're doing." Jake had to admire the honesty, even if it wasn't exactly confidence-inspiring. The convention hall erupted into chaos that made the earlier panic look like a polite disagreement. Thax 9 was roaring something about honor and glory while running in circles. Wisp had flickered out of visible existence entirely, though Jake could still hear her hyperventilating from somewhere in the fourth dimension. Shard Prime was making a sound like a crystal chandelier falling down a flight of stairs, which Jake assumed was either sobbing or swearing in her native language. Buzzkill had gone completely rigid, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lights like a disco ball having an existential crisis. "This cannot be happening," he chittered. "The Devourers were defeated, cast into the void, banished to the spaces between spaces." "Yeah, well," Jake said, watching through the massive viewport as ships that looked like someone had weaponized nightmares approached the station. "Looks like they got better." The Devourer vessels defied every principle of spacecraft design Jake had ever learned. They didn't so much fly as ooze through space, their hulls rippling and shifting like living tissue. Worst of all, they were silent. No engine signatures, no heat trails, nothing on the sensors except a growing sense of dread that the station's empathic crew members were reporting as really, really bad vibes. "Where is your mighty fleet, human Jake Martinez?" Vex the Mighty demanded, his forearms shaking as he pointed accusingly. "Surely Earth's legendary warriors are rushing to our aid as we speak." Jake scratched his head. "Well, the nearest Earth Defense Force ship is about 3 weeks away. They're dealing with a mining dispute in the Alpha Centauri system. Apparently someone's been claim-jumping asteroid belts, and you know how lawyers get about property rights." The assembled aliens stared at him with expressions that ranged from disbelief to outright horror. 3 weeks? Wisp materialized just long enough to shriek the question before disappearing again. "Look, I'm sure they'll get here eventually," Jake said. "Probably. Earth takes its diplomatic obligations very seriously, but right now it's just me, you guys, and whatever security forces this station has on hand." As if summoned by his words, a squad of station security forces jogged past the convention hall's entrance. Jake counted exactly 4 guards, armed with what appeared to be glorified stun guns and expressions of barely controlled terror. "4 guards," Shard Prime observed, her crystalline voice cracking like thin ice. "4 guards against the Devourers, the ancient enemy that consumed entire star systems before our ancestors drove them back." "To be fair," Jake said, "those 4 guards probably have pretty good training, and the station's defensive systems should help, right?" On cue, the lights flickered as the station's main weapon systems came online. Through the viewports, Jake could see the defensive turrets tracking the approaching Devourer ships and opening fire. Brilliant streams of plasma lanced out across the void, striking the alien vessels, with enough energy to vaporize a small moon. The Devourers didn't even seem to notice. "Okay," Jake said, watching the plasma bolts simply disappear into the writhing hulls of the enemy ships. "That's not great." The station shuddered as the first Devourer vessel made contact with the outer hull. Jake felt, rather than heard, something that might have been reality itself getting a little queasy. "They're not just attacking the station," Wisp said, her voice thin and distant. "They're attacking the space around the station. The fundamental structure of local reality is becoming unstable." "In layman's terms," Jake asked. "We're about to find out what it's like to exist in a universe where the laws of physics are more like polite suggestions." Jake looked around the room at the descendants of legendary heroes, cosmic gods, and reality-shaping ancestors. Every single one of them looked like they were about to wet themselves with fear, or whatever the equivalent was for beings made of crystals and fourth-dimensional energy. "Right," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "So we're on our own, the enemy is basically immune to conventional weapons, and they're planning to unmake reality until we stop existing. Does that about sum it up?" "Don't forget the part where we're all going to die horribly," Buzzkill added helpfully. "Thanks. That's very constructive." Jake walked over to the convention hall's emergency supply cabinet and started taking inventory. Emergency rations, water recycling tablets, basic medical supplies, some kind of multi-tool, and... "Is this duct tape?" "It's nano-enhanced molecular bonding strips," Sharprime corrected. "So, fancy duct tape. Perfect." Jake started stuffing supplies into a bag he'd found. Anyone know where the maintenance tunnels are? The aliens looked at him like he just suggested they all hold hands and sing show tunes. Maintenance tunnels, Thaxnam repeated. Human Jake Martinez, this is not the time for mundane infrastructure concerns. We need heroic action. Legendary solutions. Where are the weapons of power, the ancient artifacts, the mystical forces that can turn the tide of battle? Jake hefted the bag over his shoulder and looked out at the approaching devourers, their impossible ships now close enough that he could make out details he really didn't want to think about too hard. Yeah, about that, he said. I'm pretty sure the mystical forces are taking the day off, so we're going to have to go with Plan B, which is... Jake grinned, and for the first time since the alarm started, he looked genuinely happy. We're going to do what Grandma Martinez would do. We're going to survive. Survive? Thaxnak's voice cracked like a teenager asking for prom date advice. Human Jake Martinez, I don't think you understand the magnitude of this threat. The devourers don't just kill, they unmake. They turn existence into unexistence. You can't just survive that. Jake was already halfway to the maintenance panel, the fancy duct tape unrolling in his hands. Yeah, you can. You just have to be smarter about it than they are. He popped open the wall panel and started examining the station's guts. Power conduits, data cables, life support systems. All the boring stuff that kept everyone breathing and the lights on. First rule of survival. Know your environment better than whatever's trying to kill you. This is insane, Wisp flickered back into partial visibility, her ethereal form wavering like heat shimmer. We should be calling upon ancient powers, invoking legendary magics, performing the rituals of what? Dead people? Jake started rerouting some of the power cables, his hands working with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from fixing things because buying new ones wasn't an option. Look, no offense to your cosmic great, whatever ancestors, but they're not here. We are. And right now, we need solutions that work with what we've got. The station shuddered again as another devourer ship latched onto the hull. Through the walls, Jake could hear the distinct sound of reality having a bad time. A kind of grinding, sucking noise like the universe's garbage disposal trying to eat something too big. Okay, here's what we're going to do, Jake said, sealing up his impromptu rewiring job. Buzzkill, I need you to find every single maintenance worker, janitor, cook, and basically anyone whose job involves keeping this place running. Not the security forces, not the officers, the people who actually know how stuff works. But why would we need? Because, Jake interrupted, already moving toward the next panel, your legendary ancestors fought external threats. Big, obvious, dramatic enemies that came at them head on. The devourers are playing a different game entirely. They're not trying to blow us up. They're trying to wear us down, drain our power, corrupt our systems, make us collapse from the inside out. He paused in his work to look directly at the assembled aliens. That's not a job for heroes. That's a job for people who know how to make things last when everything's going to hell. Shard Prime's crystalline form chimed uncertainly. I still don't understand how your grandmother's winter survival relates to... Right, okay, story time. Jake started pulling out sections of wall paneling, exposing more of the station's infrastructure. Montana, 1932. Grandma Martinez is 22 years old, just married, living in a one-room cabin 40 miles from the nearest town. Then the worst winter in recorded state history hits. He found what he was looking for. Backup power relays that hadn't been activated in probably a decade. Temperatures dropped to 60 below zero. Snow drifts higher than houses. No electricity because the lines were down. No heat because they couldn't afford coal. No food because they couldn't get to town, and even if they could, they had exactly $73 to last until spring. Jake started cleaning the connections on the relays, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd heard this story 100 times around family dinner tables. Most people would have panicked, tried to burn furniture for warmth, eaten all their food in the first month, maybe attempted some desperate journey to town that would have killed them. You know what Grandma did instead? I'm almost afraid to ask, Wisp said. She got methodical. First thing, she calculated exactly how much food they had and divided it by the number of days winter was likely to last. Then she cut that ration in half, because winters can always last longer than you expect. She trapped rabbits and stretched every meal with whatever edible plants she could find preserved under the snow. The backup relays hummed to life. Jake grinned at the sound. For heat, she didn't waste wood on big dramatic fires. Instead, she heated rocks in a small fire outside, then brought them inside wrapped in cloth. Kept the cabin warm all night with a fraction of the fuel. When they ran out of soap, she made it from ash and animal fat. When their clothes wore out, she patched them with pieces from clothes that were worse off. Jake stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. But here's the really impressive part. She didn't just survive that winter. She prepared for the next one. Every solution she came up with, she made sure it was something she could do again, better, if she had to. Fax 9 seemed to be struggling with some concept that didn't translate well. That's not heroic, that's just practical. Exactly, Jake pointed at him like he'd just won a prize. Grandma Martinez didn't need to be a hero because heroes fight battles. She needed to be a survivor, and survivors fight systems. They fight entropy, scarcity, breakdown, the slow grind of things falling apart. He gestured toward the walls around them as another reality-grinding sound echoed through the station. The Devourers aren't coming at us like movie monsters. They're coming at us like winter. They want to drain our power, corrupt our life support, make our systems fail one by one until we just stop. They're betting we'll panic, waste our resources on dramatic gestures, burn through our resources trying to fight them head-on. Jake walked over to the environmental controls and started making adjustments. But if we treat this like Grandma Martinez treated winter, we don't try to beat them, we outlast them. How? Buzzkill chittered, though Jake noticed he was starting to sound more interested than terrified. We go dark. Minimum power to essential systems only. We seal off sections of the station we don't absolutely need, concentrate our population in areas we can defend with passive measures. We recycle everything, air, water, waste, heat. We make every calorie count, every breath count, every minute count. Jake pulled up a schematic of the station on the nearest display. Most importantly, we don't fight their reality warping directly. We work around it. When they corrupt a system, we reroute. When they drain power from one area, we shift to backups they didn't know existed. We make ourselves too stubborn to die. The aliens looked at each other with expressions Jake was learning to recognize as the universal sign of beings whose worldview was getting thoroughly rearranged. You're talking about survival tactics, Shard Prime said slowly, not battle tactics. Right, because this isn't a battle. This is a siege. And the thing about sieges is, they're not won by the side with the biggest weapons or the most dramatic ancestors. Jake started heading toward the door, the emergency supply bag still slung over his shoulder. They're won by the side that's still alive when the other side gets bored and goes home. And you think the Devourers will just leave? Jake paused at the doorway, his expression turning serious for the first time since the conversation started. I think the Devourers have been winning for 3,000 years, because everyone they've fought has tried to outhero them. Big dramatic gestures, legendary weapons, cosmic powers, all stuff that burns bright and burns out fast. He looked back at the assembled beings, descendants of gods and reality shapers and star eaters, all looking lost and confused and very, very mortal. But you know what nobody's ever tried against them? Boring them to death. Making themselves so unglamorous and persistent and absolutely ordinary that the Devourers decide this particular meal isn't worth the effort. Jake grinned again, that same expression of genuine happiness he'd worn when the crisis started. Besides, Grandma Martinez didn't just survive one winter. She survived 37 of them, raised 5 kids, outlived 2 husbands, and died peacefully in her sleep at 96. Yet, he stepped toward the maintenance tunnels, calling back over his shoulder, if we're very lucky and very smart and very, very stubborn, maybe we can be half as impressive as that. 2 hours later, Jake was elbow-deep in the station's waste reclamation system, jury-rigging a filtration bypass while Buzzkill held a flashlight and tried not to think too hard about what they were swimming through. This is absolutely disgusting, the insectoid chittered, his compound eyes reflecting the dim emergency lighting. My ancestors built dimensional doorways. I'm crawling through sewage pipes. Your ancestors never had to make a space station invisible to reality-eating monsters, Jake replied, tightening a connection with a wrench he'd improvised from a broken chair leg and some of that fancy duct tape. Besides, this isn't sewage anymore. It's our secret weapon. It smells like secret weapon, Buzzkill muttered, but he kept holding the light steady. Above them, the station groaned as another wave of Devourer ships latched onto the hull. Jake had counted 17 distinct attachment points so far, each one accompanied by that awful grinding sound of local reality getting its teeth cleaned with a chainsaw. Jake, Wisp's voice crackled through the makeshift comm system he'd cobbled together from old intercom parts. The Devourers are doing something to Section C through F. The walls they're becoming transparent. Not invisible. Transparent. Like reality is wearing thin. Good, Jake said, which earned him a look from Buzzkill that suggested the insectoid was reconsidering his alliance choices. Let them waste energy on empty sections. How's the population consolidation going? All non-essential personnel have been moved to sections J and K as requested, came Thax 9's voice, sounding distinctly unhappy about his new role as a glorified crossing guard. Though I still don't understand why we're abandoning 3/4 of the station. Jake finished his work in the pipes and started crawling toward the next junction. Because, my oversized warrior friend, we're not abandoning it. We're sacrificing it. There's a difference. He'd learned a lot about the station's layout in the past 2 hours, most of it from a maintenance worker named Pete, who'd been delighted to finally have someone ask about his job. According to Pete, the station was designed with redundant everything: backup power, secondary life support, tertiary environmental controls, even emergency food dispensers that nobody had remembered to remove after the last major refit. More importantly, it had been designed by people who understood that space stations broke down constantly, and usually in ways that made no sense whatsoever. Shard Prime, what's your status on the power redistribution? Jake asked as he emerged from the maintenance tunnel into what had once been the station's hydroponics bay and was now serving as their improvised command center. The crystalline being chimed softly, her form now glowing with a steady blue light instead of the panicked strobe pattern she'd been displaying earlier. I've managed to reroute primary power around the sections where the Devourers are feeding. But Jake, what they're doing to the station's infrastructure is impossible. They're not just draining energy, they're making the energy stop existing. But our backup systems are still functioning? Yes, though I don't understand why. By all rights, if they can eliminate energy from existence, they should be able to detect and eliminate the backups as well. Jake grinned as he started unpacking his latest scavenged supplies: medical tape, protein bars, and what appeared to be a decorative plant from someone's quarters. That's because they're not looking for backups. They're looking for primary systems. Big, obvious, important-looking stuff. He started wrapping the medical tape around the plant pot while the others watched in fascination. See, the Devourers have been winning for 3,000 years, because everyone they fight does exactly what you'd expect. They put their most important systems in the most protected places, with the biggest power sources and the most sophisticated technology. That seems logical, Vex said, though he was beginning to sound less certain about logic in general. Sure, if you're fighting a conventional enemy, but the Devourers aren't conventional. They're like cosmic auditors. They go straight for whatever looks most valuable and official. Jake held up his plant pot creation, which now had several strips of medical tape connecting it to a bundle of protein bars. So we don't give them anything that looks valuable or official. The station shuddered again, harder this time. Through the walls, they could hear the sound of metal screaming as hull plates began to warp under impossible stresses. They're getting closer, Wisp said, her voice tight with fear. I can feel them pushing against the barriers we set up. The sealed blast doors won't hold much longer. They're not supposed to, Jake said calmly. He walked over to what had been the hydroponics bay's main computer terminal and started disconnecting cables. Blast doors are obvious. They say important stuff behind here. Please consume immediately. We want them to break through. We what? Thax 9's roar could probably be heard in the next star system. Think about it. Every blast door they break, every obvious defense they overcome, every primary system they drain. That's energy they're not spending looking for the boring, mundane, absolutely ordinary life support systems that are actually keeping us alive. Jake held up a handful of fiber optic cables that had been routing data to the hydroponics computers. While they're busy turning our main power grid into cosmic snacks, our backup life support is running off what used to be decorative lighting circuits. While they're corrupting our primary computers, our environmental controls are being managed by the same processors that used to run the station's Muzak system. That's... Sharp Prime's voice took on a tone of something that might have been admiration. That's completely insane. That's survival. Grandma Martinez didn't try to defend the main house from the cold. It was too big, too obvious, too hard to heat. Instead, she and Grandpa moved into the root cellar for the worst part of winter. 8 feet underground, insulated by earth and potatoes, heated by their own body warmth and a single candle. Jake started connecting the fiber optic cables to his plant pot contraption. The cold could freeze everything above ground solid, but it couldn't touch them where they were. Too small, too hidden, too humble to be worth attacking. But we can't all fit in a root cellar equivalent, Buzzkill pointed out. No, but we can spread ourselves through a dozen root cellar equivalents. Jake activated his jury-rig device and the station's emergency lighting dimmed as power was rerouted through pathways that had never been intended to carry it. Maintenance tunnels, storage closets, storage ducts, anywhere the Devourers won't think to look because it's too mundane to be important. The hydroponics bay's main door exploded inward, revealing a writhing mass of darkness that hurt to look at directly. The Devourers had finally broken through their outer defenses. "Everyone stay calm," Jake said, though he was the only one who seemed calm. "Don't run, don't fight, don't do anything dramatic or heroic or attention-getting." "Then what do we do?" Wisp's voice was barely a whisper. Jake picked up his emergency supply bag and started walking toward a maintenance hatch that was so ordinary and utilitarian that it practically radiated boredom. "We do what Grandma Martinez did when the wolves came sniffing around the cabin." Which was, we get very, very quiet, and we wait for them to decide we're not worth the trouble. The Devourer mass flowed into the room like living shadow, tendrils of unreality reaching out to probe the abandoned computer terminals and power conduits. Where they touched, the station's hull didn't just break. It stopped having ever existed in the first place. Jake opened the maintenance hatch and gestured for the others to follow him. "Remember," he whispered as they crawled into the narrow service tunnel, "we're not heroes. We're not legends. We're not worth noticing." Behind them, the Devourers began their systematic consumption of everything that looked important, official, or powerful. They never even glanced at the maintenance hatch. "For the record," Buzzkill whispered as they crawled through the darkness, "your grandmother sounds terrifying." "Yeah," Jake whispered back, "she really was. That's probably why I'm still alive to tell you about her." Above them, the station continued to die in all the obvious places, while staying stubbornly alive in all the boring ones. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't legendary, and it definitely wasn't going to make it into any epic songs. But it was working. "Jake," Tax-9's voice was barely audible in the cramped tunnel. "How long do we have to stay hidden?" Jake checked the improvised chronometer he'd built from a broken wristwatch and some bioluminescent algae from the hydroponics bay. Grandma Martinez once spent 4 days in the root cellar, waiting out a blizzard. But she said the longest part wasn't the cold, or the hunger, or the cramped quarters. What was it? The boredom. Turns out even cosmic horrors get bored eventually. The station shuddered one more time, then fell silent except for the distant hum of life support systems running on pathways too humble for ancient entities to bother noticing. Let's find out if the Devourers are as impatient as Montana blizzards. 17 hours later, Jake was beginning to understand why his grandmother had always spoken about that root cellar winter with a particular look in her eyes. It wasn't the cold that got to you, or even the hunger. It was the waiting. The not knowing if your plan was working, or if you were just postponing the inevitable, in the most uncomfortable way possible. He was crammed into a service tunnel barely wide enough for his shoulders, sharing space with Wisp, who had helpfully made herself semi-translucent to save room, and Buzzkill, whose mandibles kept clicking in what Jake had learned was the insectoid equivalent of nervous humming. "Status report," Jake whispered into his improvised comm system, a children's toy walkie-talkie he'd found in someone's quarters and souped up with spare parts from a coffee machine. "Sector J7, all quiet," came Tax-9's voice, though the warrior sounded like he was having an existential crisis. "The Devourers consumed the main armory 3 hours ago. They seemed disappointed by the lack of resistance." "Good, Shard Prime. How are our life support levels?" "Stable," the crystalline being's voice chimed softly through the toy speaker. "Running at 63% efficiency through the backup systems, the ones routed through what used to be the automatic door controls." Jake grinned in the darkness. "When you were reduced to using door-opening circuits to keep people breathing, you had officially achieved the kind of mundane desperation that cosmic entities found beneath their notice." "Vex, what's the status on food distribution?" "I never thought I would say this," came the reply, "but I have successfully delivered protein rations using the station's pneumatic mail system. My ancestors are probably spinning in their dimensional graves." "Your ancestors never had to feed 47 beings using a network of tubes designed to deliver birthday invitations," Jake whispered back. "They're probably impressed." The station groaned around them, but it was a different kind of groan now. Not the reality-tearing scream of devourer feeding, but the ordinary mechanical complaint of a structure being held together by creative engineering and sheer, bloody mindedness. "Jake," Wisp's voice was barely audible even though she was right next to him, "I think something's changing. The Devourers, they seem agitated." Jake closed his eyes and listened. She was right. The background noise of cosmic horror had shifted from satisfied munching to something that sounded distinctly like frustration. "They've consumed everything obvious," he murmured. "All the primary systems, all the important-looking infrastructure, all the stuff that screams critical station functions. And we're still here. But surely they can sense us. Buzzkill chittered. They're cosmic entities. They can unmake reality itself. Sure, but think about it from their perspective. They've just spent 17 hours thoroughly devouring what appeared to be a fully functional space station. By all rights, everything inside should be dead. The fact that we're not isn't heroic resistance. It's a bookkeeping error. Through the walls, they could hear a sound that Jake's brain kept trying to interpret as frustrated muttering. If frustrated muttering could be done by entities that existed in 11 dimensions and considered linear time a suggestion. I think, Jake said slowly, they're starting to realize this meal is more trouble than it's worth. Another sound echoed through the station. A deep, resonant tone that felt like the universe clearing its throat in annoyance. That's the sound of cosmic entities getting bored, Jake announced. Grandma Martinez would be proud. The station shuddered one more time, but this time it felt different. Not the violent shake of reality being torn apart, but the gentle bump of something large detaching from the hull. They're leaving, Wisp breathed, her form flickering with what Jake had learned to recognize as disbelief. Status report from all sectors, Jake said into his toy-com system. Sector J7, Devourers withdrawing, came Thax 9's voice, sounding like he couldn't quite believe his own words. Sector K12, hostile contacts moving away from the station, Shard Prime reported. Sector L4, they're actually leaving, Vex added. The Devourers are actually leaving. Jake waited another 10 minutes, listening to the sounds of ancient cosmic entities giving up and going to find easier prey, before he finally allowed himself to believe it. Okay, everyone, we can come out now, but slowly. No sudden movements, no celebrations, nothing dramatic. As far as the universe is concerned, we're still just boring maintenance workers who happen to survive a minor system malfunction. One by one, the station's survivors emerged from their hiding places. Jake found himself back in what remained of the convention hall, looking out through viewports that now showed empty space where the Devourer fleet had been. They're really gone, Thax 9 said, his voice full of wonder. The ancient enemy, the terror that consumed star systems, defeated by hiding in service tunnels and pretending to be unimportant. Not defeated, Jake corrected, settling back into his folding chair and looking around for any coffee that might have survived the siege. Bored. There's a difference. But how? Wisp materialized fully, her ethereal form more solid than Jake had seen it since the crisis began. How did you know this would work? Jake found a half-empty cup of coffee that had somehow avoided being unmade from reality and took a cautious sip. Still terrible, but it was warm and caffeinated, which made it better than anything his grandmother had been able to brew during the worst parts of winter. Because, he said, I finally understood what made Grandma Martinez Winter's story so impressive. It wasn't just that she survived. Lots of people survived that winter. It wasn't even that she kept her family alive, though that was pretty great. He looked around at the assembled beings, descendants of cosmic heroes and reality shapers, all of whom were now covered in maintenance dust and looking thoroughly ordinary. The impressive part was that she made it look easy, not because it was easy, but because she refused to make it dramatic. Every solution she came up with was quiet, practical, sustainable. She didn't fight the winter, she just made herself too stubborn and too boring for the winter to bother with. Jake stood up and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars that were once again just stars instead of backgrounds for cosmic horror. Your ancestors were heroes, and that's amazing. They fought impossible battles against legendary foes and won through courage and power and dramatic sacrifice. But, Shard Prime asked, but heroes fight battles, survivors outlast sieges, and sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is be so absolutely, determinedly ordinary that the universe gets tired of trying to make you special. Buzzkill's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. So we won because we were boring? We won because we treated this like Grandma Martinez treated winter, not as an epic struggle between good and evil, but as a logistical problem with a practical solution, Jake grinned. Though I have to admit, spending 17 hours in a maintenance tunnel sharing space with interdimensional beings wasn't exactly what I expected when I signed up for the cultural exchange program. Jake, Thax 9 said, and his voice carried a respect that hadn't been there before. Your grandmother sounds like she was quite remarkable. Yeah, she was. But here's the thing. She didn't think she was remarkable. She thought she was just doing what needed to be done. Keeping her family alive, making things work, getting through another day. Jake looked around at the group of beings who had just survived something that had destroyed civilizations, using nothing but mundane infrastructure and stubborn persistence. Every human has stories like that. Not about fighting star demons or reshaping reality, but about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone had to. Parents working 3 jobs to keep their kids fed. Farmers saving their crops through impossible droughts. People rebuilding their lives after everything fell apart. He picked up his emergency supply bag, still half full of protein bars and improvised tools. We don't need legendary ancestors because every generation makes its own legends. Quiet ones, usually. The kind that get passed down at family dinners instead of carved into monuments. And that's your superpower? Wisp asked. Ordinary heroism. That's our superpower. The ability to look at impossible situations and ask not how do we win, but how do we keep going. Jake headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at his unlikely team of survivors. Besides, I think Grandma Martinez would have liked you all. She always said the best people to have in a crisis were the ones who didn't spend a lot of time talking about how great they used to be. As the station's emergency systems began the long process of restoring normal operations, Jake Martinez walked out of the convention hall, already composing the incident report he'd have to file with Earth Command. It was going to be a very boring report, exactly the way he wanted it. After all, the most successful survival stories were the ones that made surviving look easy. And somewhere in the spaces between stars, a fleet of cosmic horrors moved on to find prey that would put up a more interesting fight, completely unaware that they had just been defeated by the memory of an old woman who had outlasted a Montana winter with nothing but stubbornness, creativity, and the absolute refusal to make a big deal about it. Just the way Grandma Martinez would have wanted it.